My father continually took my possessions, asserting I was having a mental breakdown. I watched his complexion completely blanch when I presented the proof. What if the person who was supposed to protect you, your own father, was the one systematically stealing from you? And then, when you dared to speak up, he convinced everyone you were the one losing your mind? How do you fight back against a betrayal that deep? Can you even imagine your own father, the man who's supposed to be your protector, starting to steal from you when you're just a kid, barely 12 years old? It began with these little things, you know? My birthday money, gone from my desk. He'd swear up and down he never touched it. You must have misplaced it, he'd say, looking me dead in the eye. Then, my brand new headphones vanished. A few weeks later, Kyle from my math class, of all people, shows up wearing them. My headphones. He told me his dad bought them from mine at some garage sale we supposedly had. My stomach dropped. When I confronted my dad, he just laughed. Called me paranoid. Said I was developing trust issues and needed therapy. He twisted it so much, he even got my mom to believe I was just going through some weird phase, accusing everyone. It was utterly soul-crushing. By high school, I learned. Money went into a tampon box. Electronics stayed locked in my locker. Gifts from relatives? Straight to friends' houses. But it never really mattered. He always found them. Getting my first job at 14? That was my escape. Every single paycheck went into a secret bank account he didn't know about. I never brought cash home. I bought this clunky combination safe from a thrift store, bolted it inside my closet. He tried to pry it open while I was at school. Left these deep gouges, then clumsily painted over them, thinking I wouldn't notice. Oh, but I noticed. I even started buying 2 of everything when I could afford it. One for him to steal, one hidden at my job. My boss, bless her heart, let me keep a box of belongings in her office storage room after I explained my situation. She thought I was exaggerating, a dramatic teenager, until my graphing calculator showed up with her neighbor's kid. That's when it truly hit me. My dad was selling my stuff to everyone in town, painting me as the girl who just outgrew things and asked him to get rid of them. I built myself a reputation as the girl whose dad was always having mysterious garage sales with suspiciously new-looking items. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my escape. But he just got worse. I came home for winter break one time and my entire bookshelf was empty. Later, I see my annotated chemistry textbook, the one I'd poured hours into, with Ashley from my graduating class. My dad said the books were just cluttering the house. When I showed him the receipt, he just scoffed. Said receipts could be faked. He called me delusional. My mom, bless her heart, actually started suggesting a psychiatric evaluation. My own mother. During spring break, my entire winter wardrobe was gone. My favorite coat? Popped up on Rebecca's Instagram. She thanked her mom for the vintage find from Mr. Howard's collection. My dad had told her mom I'd donated everything before going back to school. Messages started rolling in from old classmates asking if I was selling other things. Their parents apparently thought I was funding college by selling off my old stuff. It was like he was systematically dismantling my life, piece by piece, while convincing everyone I was the problem. Last month. Finals week. I'd saved 2 years for this. And $1,800 laptop for my computer science degree. Something powerful enough for programming, for design. I came home for one day to grab winter clothes because he'd sold mine, remember? I left my laptop in my locked bedroom for just 3 hours while I went to lunch with my mom. When I came back, it was gone. Just gone. My dad, cool as a cucumber, said he'd never seen it. Stress is making you forgetful, he murmured. I tore my room apart. My car. Even drove back to campus frantic. Nothing. I failed 2 finals. 2. Because I couldn't access my projects. My professors gave me incomplete grades, said I could retake them if I provided proof of extenuating circumstances. And my dad? He called them himself. Told them I was having mental health issues, making up theft stories for attention. The sheer audacity. Yesterday. I needed a computer for job applications because I'd lost my internship over those incompletes. I'm at the coffee shop, and then I see him. Daniel, whose younger brother was in my high school class. And on his lap? My laptop. Same stickers. Same scratch from when I dropped it freshman year. My heart hammered. I asked him where he got it. He said his brother bought it from my dad last week for $800 cash. My dad told them I'd graduated early and left electronics behind. I asked Daniel to open the system info. There it was. My Apple ID. My name. My user profile. All my finals projects, sitting in a folder labeled with my student ID. Daniel went pale. He knew. His brother arrived, confirmed the story. My dad said I'd dropped out. My blood was boiling. I asked them to come with me to my parents' house. They agreed, both of them furious at being unwitting accomplices to theft. We walked into that house, and the look on my father's face when he saw me with Daniel and his brother, honestly, it was worth every single stolen item from my entire childhood. Daniel's brother demanded his money back immediately. My dad tried his usual song and dance, misunderstandings, my mental health. That's when Daniel opened my laptop, right there in front of him. My name on the screen. My projects. My family photos. All my mom had to do was walk in and see it laid bare. My dad, desperate, tried one last time to claim I'd permitted him. That's when I pulled out my phone. I filed a police report 3 days ago, I said, my voice shaking but firm, for an $1,800 stolen laptop. I told him he still owed me $1,000. He just laughed. Prove I took it, he sneered. But Daniel's brother was already pulling out his phone. And my dad's laugh died in his throat. The screen turned toward us. A text thread. My father's number, right at the top. Messages from last week, confirming the sale. My dad, in his own words, saying the laptop belonged to his daughter, who dropped out of college and left it behind, that he was cleaning out her abandoned room. Daniel's brother had even asked if I knew about the sale, and my dad replied that I'd moved out permanently and wanted everything gone. The messages went on, my father assuring him the laptop was in perfect condition because I'd barely used it before quitting school. My mom leaned in to read the screen, her hand clamped over her mouth. My dad's face went from pale to gray. All the blood just drained from his skin as he stared at the proof of his lies, written out in his own words. He opened his mouth. Twice. Nothing came out. His usual smooth excuses, dead before they could even form. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to brace my elbow against my side just to photograph Daniel's brother's screen. Every message. Timestamps. Phone numbers. All documented. I scrolled through, taking multiple shots of the entire conversation while Daniel's brother held his phone perfectly still. My father just watched me document everything, his jaw working, unable to figure out what to say. I saved those photos to 3 different places, my phone storage, cloud backup, and emailed them to myself. This was it. I grabbed my laptop from where Daniel had set it on the coffee table, clutching it against my chest like it was a lifeline, something I'd thought was lost forever. It felt solid, real, heavier than I remembered. I walked straight out to my car in the driveway, popped the trunk, found an old blanket I kept for emergencies, and wrapped it carefully, tucking it into a corner. Closed and locked the trunk with my key fob. My hands were still shaking as I tested the trunk to make sure it was secure. For the first time in years, I had something valuable in my physical possession that he couldn't steal back while I dealt with the mess inside. I walked back into the house. Everyone was still standing in the living room, frozen in place. My father was on the couch now, head in his hands. My mother stood behind him, arms crossed. Daniel's brother cleared his throat. I want my $800 back right now before anything else happens. My father looked up slowly, still that awful gray color, and with shaking hands, pulled out his wallet. He counted out $500, then went to his desk, pulled out a stack of bills, and counted out $300 more. Daniel's brother recounted it carefully, folded the money, and pocketed it. I stepped forward. You still owe me $1,000, I told my father. You sold my $1,800 laptop for $800. He laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Prove I took it. I started to respond, but Daniel's brother was already pulling his phone back out. My father's laugh died in his throat. I have proof now, I said, written proof, in your own words, that you sold my property without permission while lying about me dropping out of school. My mother made a soft sound behind him, but said nothing. My father stared at the floor. He didn't have $1,000 right now, he mumbled. When will you? I asked. Can you set up a payment plan? Anything to acknowledge the debt. He just kept staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to answer or even look at me. Daniel, who'd been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up. This was clearly theft with documentation, and we should call the police. His brother agreed immediately, saying they wanted this on record to protect themselves from any charges about receiving stolen property. I pulled up my phone, found the police report I'd filed 3 days ago, and showed them the case number. Daniel asked if he should call, and I nodded, giving him the non-emergency number. He dialed. My father sat frozen on the couch, hands gripping his knees. I could hear Daniel explaining the situation to the dispatcher, giving our address, saying we had evidence of theft and needed officers to come document everything. The dispatcher said someone would be there within the hour. My mother asked if we really needed to involve the police. Her voice high and nervous. This is a family matter, she pleaded. We can work it out ourselves. My father didn't say anything, just sat there, staring at nothing. I felt that old instinct rise up in me, the familiar pressure to back down, to keep the peace, to smooth everything over and pretend nothing was wrong. I'd spent my whole childhood doing that, accepting his lies and gaslighting to avoid confrontation. My throat felt tight, and I wanted to tell everyone to leave, to forget the whole thing, to just take my laptop and disappear. But I stayed quiet. Let the evidence speak for itself instead of getting pulled into another argument I couldn't win with words alone. We waited 40 minutes for the police to arrive. My father sat on the couch the entire time, not speaking, occasionally rubbing his face with both hands. My mother hovered between the kitchen and living room, asking if anyone wanted water or coffee, her hands fluttering nervously. Nobody responded to her offers. Daniel and his brother stood near the door, occasionally looking at their phones, but mostly just waiting in uncomfortable silence. I sat in the armchair across from my father, watching him, thinking about all the times he'd sat in that exact spot and lied to my face about stealing my things. The house felt too small, too quiet. Every tiny sound amplified. At one point, my father tried to say something about work stress, about how his job had been difficult lately and he'd made some bad choices. My mother jumped on this. Yes, he's been under so much pressure. We should consider what he's been dealing with. I didn't respond. Neither did Daniel or his brother. My father's attempt at explanation died in the silence, and he went back to staring at the floor. I checked my phone several times, watching the minutes tick by, wondering if the police would actually come. But at 43 minutes after Daniel's call, I saw red and blue lights flash through the front window. 2 patrol officers came to the door, a man and a woman, both professional and alert. They asked what was going on, and Daniel's brother explained about buying the stolen laptop, finding out it was mine, coming here for a refund, and discovering the text messages. The female officer asked to see the messages, and Daniel's brother showed her his phone. She photographed the screen with her own phone, then asked to see my police report. I pulled it up, showed her the case number from 3 days ago. She wrote everything down in a small notebook. The male officer took my father into the kitchen first, closing the door. The female officer, whose name tag read Clay, asked me to step outside onto the front porch with her. She asked me to walk through everything from the beginning, when I first noticed the laptop missing, what I did to try to find it when I filed the report. I explained the whole timeline, showed her the Apple ID registration on my phone, proving continuous ownership, and described finding Daniel at the coffee shop. She took detailed notes, asking specific questions about dates and times. When she asked if my father had taken other items over the years, I told her yes, that this had been happening since I was 12. She wrote that down, too, underlining something in her notebook. After she finished with me, she talked to Daniel, then his brother, getting their statements. The whole process took over an hour, each person interviewed separately. The male officer came out of the kitchen with my father and asked to speak with him more in the living room. I could hear parts of the conversation from the porch. The officer was asking about other items my father had sold, whether he had records or receipts. My father's voice was low, but I caught him saying he had nothing more to say without a lawyer present. The officer's tone stayed professional, explaining that refusing to answer questions was his right, but it would be noted in the report. He asked again about the pattern of selling my belongings, mentioning my previous claims about years of theft. My father repeated that he wanted a lawyer. The officer said he understood and would document the refusal to answer. Officer Clay came back to me and said they were assigning a case number for follow-up investigation, that a detective would likely contact me in the next few days. She said the text messages and my existing police report created a clear pattern of theft that they'd investigate further. She gave me a card with the case number written on it and told me to call if I remembered any other details or if my father contacted me about the case. Then both officers left, their patrol car pulling away slowly down the street. Daniel and his brother said goodbye, Daniel squeezing my shoulder briefly before they walked to their car. My mother went upstairs without saying anything. My father stayed on the couch, still not looking at anyone. I left without a word, got in my car, and drove away. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, 10 minutes from my parents' house, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down enough to drive safely. My whole body felt shaky and strange, like I'd been holding tension for so long that releasing it left me weak. I popped the trunk and unwrapped my laptop, bringing it into the front seat with me. Opening it with trembling hands, I logged in and navigated to my documents folder. There it was, the folder labeled with my student ID number, containing all my finals projects. I clicked through each file, checking that they were intact and not corrupted. Everything was there, exactly as I'd left it before my father stole the laptop, my programming assignments, my design projects, all the work I'd done over the semester. I opened my email and saw the messages from my professors about my incomplete grades. The stern reminders about deadlines, the final notice that my incompletes would become failures if I didn't complete the work. Seeing those messages made my throat tight and my eyes burn. I'd worked so hard all semester, spent hundreds of hours on these projects, only to have my father steal my laptop and destroy my grades in one afternoon. The unfairness of it hit me again, fresh and raw, making me want to cry all over again, even though I'd already cried so much over the past few weeks. I drove to a coffee shop with Wi-Fi and opened my laptop at a corner table. I spent 2 hours composing emails to my professors, attaching screenshots of the police report, the Apple ID registration showing continuous ownership, and photos of Daniel's brother's text messages proving my laptop had been stolen. I explained that my father had called them claiming I had mental health issues, which was part of his cover-up for stealing my property and sabotaging my education. I wrote carefully, keeping my tone professional and factual, not emotional or accusatory toward them. I acknowledged that my father's call had seemed credible, and I understood why they'd taken it seriously. But I asked them to review my case with this new evidence, showing that my laptop had been stolen during finals week, and I'd been unable to access my projects through no fault of my own. I attached documentation of everything, organized it clearly, and sent the emails one by one. Each send felt like a small victory, like I was finally fighting back against the narrative my father had created about me being unstable and unreliable. I was presenting facts, evidence, proof that I'd been telling the truth all along. One professor responded within an hour, before I'd even finished my second coffee. Dr. Steele, who taught my programming course, sent a message apologizing for taking my father's call seriously. She said she should have verified information before making assumptions about my situation. Her message said she felt terrible about contributing to the problem by believing my father's lies about my mental health. She offered to meet first thing tomorrow morning to discuss fixing my incomplete grade. Said she'd review my projects and give me credit for the work I'd completed before the theft. She also said she'd be filing a report with the dean's office about my father's inappropriate contact since parents weren't supposed to interfere with student academic matters. Reading her response made something loosen in my chest, a tight knot I'd been carrying since failing those finals. Someone believed me. Someone with authority was acknowledging that I'd been telling the truth, that I wasn't making up stories or having a breakdown. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, just breathing, feeling like maybe things could actually get better from here. That night, I packed my laptop and drove the 2 hours back to campus instead of staying another minute in that house. My friend let me crash on her dorm couch without asking questions. Just handed me a pillow and blanket. My mother called twice before midnight, but I sent both to voicemail, needing space to process everything without her trying to smooth things over or defend what my father had done. The couch was lumpy and too short, but I felt safer there than in my childhood bedroom, where my father could walk in any time. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to my friend's quiet breathing from across the room. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I finally let myself think about all those years of stolen birthday money, missing clothes, and disappeared electronics as abuse instead of bad luck or my own carelessness. The gaslighting about my mental health was designed to make everyone dismiss my accurate reports of theft. And it had worked for years. My father had systematically stolen from me since I was 12 while convincing my mother, teachers, and neighbors that I was paranoid and unstable. Every time I'd hidden something or bought duplicates or stashed belongings at work, I'd been protecting myself from ongoing theft while being told I needed therapy for trust issues. The next morning, I borrowed my friend's laptop and started a detailed spreadsheet listing every item I could remember my father stealing. I put in approximate dates based on when things went missing, values from receipts I'd saved in a folder on my recovered laptop, and notes about who ended up with each item when I could track that down. The birthday money from age 12 through 16, probably $800 total. The headphones, graphing calculator, and electronics from high school, another $1,000. The entire bookshelf of textbooks from winter break, at least $2,000 in annotated books I'd spent years collecting. My winter wardrobe from spring break, $1,500 in coats and sweaters. The laptop was the biggest single theft at $1,800. The total came to over $15,000 across 8 years, not counting items I'd forgotten or couldn't prove with receipts. I stared at that number for a long time, feeling sick, but also vindicated that I'd been right all along about the scale of what was happening. I opened social media and started searching for photos of my stolen belongings. Screenshots ready. Found my winter coat in Rebecca's Instagram from last month. A post thanking her mom for the vintage find with 3 heart emojis. My chemistry textbook showed up in Ashley's posts from fall semester, open on her desk in a study session photo. The graphing calculator appeared in a neighbor kid's back-to-school photo, visible in his backpack next to new notebooks. I took screenshots of everything, saved them to a new folder labeled Evidence with a date. Each photo felt like proof that I wasn't crazy, that these things had really been mine before my father sold them. I added the social media screenshots to my spreadsheet with links and dates, building a timeline that showed the pattern clearly. My hands shook a little as I worked, but I kept going, adding every piece of documentation I could find. My father sent a text around noon saying I was overreacting and this whole thing was tearing the family apart. He said he'd made mistakes, but I was being cruel by involving police over misunderstandings that could have been handled privately. The text tried to make me feel guilty for having consequences for his theft, like I was the problem for reporting crimes instead of quietly accepting abuse. I screenshot the message without responding and saved it to my evidence folder, recognizing the manipulation pattern of blaming me for consequences of his own actions. He wanted me to feel bad for protecting myself, to back down and let him keep stealing because family should forgive anything. I wasn't falling for it anymore. 3 days later, the police department called, saying Detective Curtis Shaw had been assigned to my case and wanted to schedule a formal statement. The officer on the phone sounded professional and serious, not dismissive like I'd worried they might be. I felt a small flutter of hope that someone with authority was actually taking this seriously instead of writing me off as dramatic or mentally unstable like my father had trained everyone to do. We scheduled an appointment for the next afternoon at the station, and I spent the rest of the day organizing my evidence folder and spreadsheet so everything would be clear and easy to follow. I met with Detective Shaw at the station and spent 2 hours walking through my timeline spreadsheet, showing photos of stolen items on social media and explaining the gaslighting pattern that had made it hard for anyone to believe me for years. Shaw listened without interrupting, took detailed notes in a small notebook, and asked specific questions about dates and values, and who had ended up with items. He treated my account as credible evidence rather than questionable claims from someone having a breakdown. When I showed him the text messages from my father and the screenshots from social media, he nodded and made more notes, his face serious and focused. Nobody had ever listened to me talk about the theft this way before, actually believing what I said and documenting it like real crimes instead of family drama. Shaw explained that while he could pursue charges for the laptop theft since it was recent and well documented with the police report and Apple ID registration, most of the older items would be harder to prosecute. Too much time had passed, and it would be difficult to prove lack of consent for things I'd left at my parents' house, even though I'd never actually given permission. He was honest that the case had limitations because of how theft laws worked with family members and property stored in shared homes. But he confirmed my father's behavior fit a pattern of financial exploitation and abuse. That the gaslighting about mental health was a classic tactic abusers used to discredit victims. Hearing a detective say those words, calling it abuse and exploitation instead of misunderstandings, made something loosen in my chest. I contacted my academic advisor, Gabriella Sandoval, through email that evening and asked about the incomplete grades and possible FERPA violations since my father had called professors making false claims about my mental health without my permission. She responded within an hour saying she wanted to meet first thing in the morning, that she was horrified by what I described and needed to document everything for the dean's office immediately. I felt relieved that someone at the university was taking this seriously, too, not just brushing it off as family problems that weren't their concern. The next morning, I sat in Gabriella's office and walked through the whole situation again, showing her the police reports and evidence of the laptop theft and explaining how my father had sabotaged my grades by calling professors. Gabriella outlined the process for grade appeals with supporting documentation and explained the timeline for getting my incompletes reviewed before they became permanent failures on my transcript. She said I'd need to submit formal appeals with the police reports, evidence of the theft, and statements from the professors who'd given me incompletes originally. The process would take a few weeks, but she thought I had a strong case given the documentation. She also filed a FERPA complaint right there during our meeting about my father accessing my academic information without authorization and making false statements to faculty about my mental health. She typed up the complaint while I sat there, asking me questions about dates and which professors he'd contacted. Her face was angry on my behalf as she documented everything. I left Gabriella's office and walked straight back to my dorm room, sat on my bed, and pulled out my phone. Opened a new text to my father, typed out every word carefully because this needed to be clear and saved as proof. The message stated I never gave permission to sell any of my belongings, that all future disposal of my property without written consent would be reported as theft, and that he should not contact me about anything related to my possessions. Read it 3 times before hitting send. Watched the delivered notification pop up. Took a screenshot immediately and saved it to 3 different folders on my phone and laptop. Created a new document on my computer titled Legal Documentation and pasted the screenshot there with the date and time. This was my line in the sand. Documented proof that I'd told him to stop. My mother called 2 days later. I almost didn't answer but picked up on the 4th ring. She said my father wanted to pay for family therapy to work through our issues. I felt that old pressure to agree, to smooth things over, to make everyone comfortable. I told her I would only consider individual counseling for myself, not joint sessions. She sounded hurt. Asked why I wouldn't try to fix our family. I explained that family therapy would just give my father another platform to twist the story and make me look unstable. She went quiet for a long moment, said she understood, but hoped I'd change my mind eventually. I stayed firm, repeated that individual counseling was my only option. We ended the call without resolving anything. Detective Shaw called a week later with an update. He'd been collecting written statements from Daniel, his brother, and several other people who'd bought items from my father over the years. I met him at a coffee shop where he showed me copies of the statements. Person after person confirmed my father told them I'd given permission or abandoned the items. One neighbor said my father specifically mentioned I was cleaning out for college. Another said he'd claimed I was selling things to fund my education. The statements all contradicted my father's claims that the sales were authorized. Curtis said this pattern of lying to buyers was important evidence. Asked if I knew anyone else who might have purchased my belongings. I gave him 5 more names with contact information. Curtis scheduled an interview with my father at the station. My father showed up with a notebook and maintained he believed he had permission to sell things I'd left behind at the house. The detective asked him to provide any written consent or communication, showing I agreed to the sales. My father couldn't produce anything. No texts, no emails, no notes, nothing showing I'd ever said he could sell my stuff. Curtis pressed him about the specific items and dates. My father got mad, said he was being treated like a criminal over family disagreements. Started talking about how kids leave things at their parents' houses all the time and parents have a right to clear out clutter. The detective noted his defensive responses and inability to show consent in the report. Word spread fast through our small town about the investigation. I started getting messages from people who'd bought my stuff. Some were mean, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing and trying to get them in trouble for receiving stolen property. Others apologized and offered to return items if I refunded their money. I couldn't afford to buy back my own stolen belongings. Living on campus with no income after losing my laptop and failing finals meant I was barely covering food. Each message asking for refunds made me feel worse about a situation I didn't create. I stopped responding to most of them after a while. A neighbor sent me a long email about my winter coat. She'd paid $40 for it at one of my father's sales. Said she'd be happy to return it if I paid her back the money she spent. I stared at that email for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to respond. Typed out an explanation that I was a college student with no income and couldn't afford to buy back property that was stolen from me in the first place. She wrote back angry, said if I couldn't reimburse her, then she was keeping the coat since she'd paid for it in good faith. I felt sick reading her response, but had no way to get the coat back without money I didn't have. I researched legal aid services in the area and found Ivy Marsh's name listed as an attorney who handled civil cases. Called and scheduled a consultation to discuss options for recovering the $1,000 difference and preventing future theft. The appointment was set for the following week. I showed up at the legal aid office with my laptop bag full of printed documentation. Ivy listened to everything for 90 minutes, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked detailed questions about the police investigation, the protective order possibilities, and my father's pattern of behavior. Said I had grounds for a formal demand letter and potentially a protective order regarding my property. Explained the process would take time, but I had strong documentation supporting my case. Ivy spent the next few days drafting a formal demand letter. She emailed me a copy to review before sending it. The letter required my father to pay the remaining $1,000 within 30 days and to stop disposing of any items I'd stored at the house without written permission. It referenced the police investigation and warned that failure to follow these terms would result in civil action. I approved the letter, and Ivy sent it certified mail so we'd have proof of delivery. It felt good to have official legal documentation demanding what he owed me instead of just asking and getting laughed at. My father responded 3 days after receiving the demand letter. Sent me a text threatening to sue me for telling people he was a thief. Said I was damaging his reputation and he'd take legal action if I kept spreading lies about him. I screenshot the message immediately and forwarded it to Ivy. She called within an hour, said the threat was empty intimidation with no legal basis. Explained that truth is an absolute defense against claims like that, and I had police reports and witness statements backing up everything I'd said. She added his threatening text to our evidence file as proof he was trying to silence me instead of addressing the actual theft. My mother showed up at my dorm unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking back from class when I saw her car in the parking lot. She asked if we could talk somewhere private. We sat in her car for almost an hour. She admitted she'd noticed the scratches on my safe years ago. Said she suspected my father was trying to break into it, but convinced herself she was imagining things. Told me she should have asked me about it back then instead of ignoring what she saw. I asked if she'd be willing to make a formal statement about the safe or testify if needed. She shook her head, said she couldn't go against my father publicly like that. Her quiet admission that she knew something was wrong felt like a small piece of proof after years of being called crazy and paranoid, even if she wouldn't say it officially. Detective Shaw called 2 days later, asking if I could help build the case by finding more proof through social media. He wanted permission to contact people who showed up in photos with my stolen stuff and needed me to make a list with links and contact info for everyone. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through Instagram, Facebook, and old class group chats, looking for any pictures that showed my belongings. Found my graphing calculator in a back-to-school post from 3 years ago, my winter coat in Rebecca's photos from last month, and my chemistry textbook in Ashley's study session pictures. I made a spreadsheet with names, social media handles, links to specific posts, and dates for everything I could find. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight, and my eyes hurt from staring at my phone screen for 6 hours straight, but I had 43 entries with solid documentation. Sent the whole thing to Detective Shaw with a note saying he could contact anyone on the list. He responded within 20 minutes, thanking me and saying this would help establish the pattern of theft over multiple years. The next morning, Gabriella called, saying she'd set up a meeting with the department chair about my incomplete grades. She spent an hour going over all my documentation about the stolen laptop and explaining how my father had called my professors making false claims about my mental health. The department chair agreed to review the incomplete from the professor, who'd apologized since that professor had already admitted believing my father's lies was a mistake. The other professor was being difficult though, insisting I should have backed everything up to the cloud and that losing my laptop wasn't a good enough excuse for missing finals. Gabriella pushed back hard, pointing out that theft of property isn't the same as regular negligence, and got me added to the next appeals committee meeting scheduled for 3 weeks out. I thanked her about 10 times before hanging up, feeling like maybe I could actually fix the academic damage my father had caused. I started looking for somewhere to live that same afternoon since I couldn't stay at my parents' house anymore and needed my own space while dealing with all the legal stuff. Campus housing was full for summer, but I found a cheap sublet posted on the student message board. Went to see it that evening and met the girl who was subletting her room while she did an internship across the state. The place was small and kind of run down, but it was $250 a month, including utilities, and only 15 minutes from campus. My finances were really tight between losing my planned internship and having to pay for summer classes to make up the failed grades. But having somewhere safe to live felt more important than saving money. Signed the sublease agreement right there and moved in 3 days later with 2 suitcases of clothes and my laptop. The first night in my new place, I actually slept through the whole night without waking up every few hours checking if my stuff was still there. Woke up around 8 o'clock in the morning feeling more rested than I had in weeks. Then just started crying and couldn't stop for almost 20 minutes. Sat on the floor of my tiny room, processing how messed up it was that I'd spent years sleeping in a house where I had to worry about my own father stealing things while I was asleep. Realized I'd lost that basic feeling of home being a safe place where your family protects your belongings instead of taking them. The grief hit different from the anger I'd been feeling, like mourning something I should have had, but never really did. A week later, I was checking my email and saw a security alert from Apple saying someone had tried to log into my Apple ID from a device I didn't recognize. Immediately opened my account settings and found 3 failed login attempts from an IP address I didn't know over the past 2 days. Changed all my passwords right away and turned on 2-factor authentication for everything. The attempt stopped completely after I updated my security settings. It took me about 5 seconds to figure out my father had probably tried accessing my account to delete evidence or track what I was doing. Screenshot all the security alerts and saved them to my evidence folder. Then called Detective Shaw to let him know. He said the threatening text my father had sent combined with these login attempts created a pattern of continued harassment that went beyond just the original theft. Suggested I talk to my legal aid attorney about getting a protective order since my father was clearly still trying to interfere with my property and privacy. I made an appointment with Ivy for the next day and brought all my documentation about the texts and the login attempts. She reviewed everything carefully and said we had grounds to file for a civil protective order specifically focused on my property rights and preventing contact about my belongings. I spent 2 hours filling out the petition while Ivy helped me organize all the evidence chronologically. The petition documented the years of theft starting when I was 12, the recent laptop incident with all the proof, the threatening texts where my father said he'd sue me for calling him a thief, and the suspicious account access attempts showing ongoing violation of my rights. We filed everything at the courthouse that afternoon, and the clerk said a hearing would be scheduled within 2 weeks. My father hired a lawyer who sent a formal letter to Ivy's office 5 days later, claiming I was making everything sound worse than it actually was. The letter said normal disagreements between parents and kids about property didn't need protective orders, and that I was being dramatic. My mother sent me an email the same day saying she planned to attend the hearing, but didn't say whose side she was on or whether she'd be supporting me or my father. I started preparing for the hearing by printing out all my evidence and organizing it in chronological order in a binder with tabs for different categories. Ivy coached me on how to stay calm while describing the theft pattern without getting emotional or defensive. She said I needed to answer questions directly and let the documentation speak for itself instead of trying to convince anyone I was telling the truth since the evidence was stronger than any argument I could make. I practiced going through my timeline out loud several times until I could talk about the theft without my voice shaking or getting angry. The morning of the hearing, I drove to the courthouse an hour early and sat in my car going over my notes one more time. Ivy had told me to avoid any conversations with my father or his lawyer in the hallway to keep my focus on presenting evidence rather than getting pulled into arguments. I walked into the building and saw my father standing near the courtroom doors with a man in a suit who must have been his lawyer. I kept my eyes forward and went straight to where Ivy was waiting near the clerk's office. My mother was already sitting in the back row of the courtroom, looking miserable and tired, but she didn't try to approach either me or my father before things started. The judge walked in, and everyone stood up until she sat down behind the bench. She opened a thick folder and spent what felt like forever reading through everything while the courtroom stayed quiet except for papers rustling. I watched her flip through page after page of the police reports, then pause on the screenshots of text messages, then study the social media photos showing my stolen stuff in other people's hands. Ivy had organized everything with tabs and highlighted sections, and the judge kept going back to certain pages, like she was checking facts against each other. My father's lawyer tried to speak up twice, but the judge held up one hand without looking at him and kept reading. After maybe 20 minutes, she closed the folder and looked directly at my father for a long moment before turning to me. She asked if I understood what a protective order meant, and I said yes, that it would legally prevent my father from taking or selling my property. She nodded and said based on the documented pattern of theft over 8 years, the recent laptop incident with clear proof, the threatening texts, and the suspicious account access attempts, she was issuing a temporary protective order, effective immediately. The order said my father couldn't sell, throw away, or touch any property I owned without my written permission, and he couldn't contact me about property stuff except through lawyers. She set a date 6 months out to review whether to make it permanent, and told my father that violating the order would result in contempt charges. My father's lawyer started talking about how this was excessive for family disagreements, but the judge cut him off and said the evidence showed systematic theft and intimidation, not normal parent-child conflicts about belongings. We left the courtroom, and Ivy told me to document any violations immediately and call the police if my father tried to contact me directly. I felt weird walking out, like something important had happened, but I was too tired to process what it meant yet. I got a call 4 days later from someone at the district attorney's office saying they'd reviewed the laptop case and were considering filing misdemeanor theft charges since the documentation was solid and the value was over the legal threshold. The woman on the phone explained that with the police report, the text messages from Daniel's brother, the Apple ID registration, and my father's own admission that he sold it, they had enough evidence to prosecute. She asked if I was willing to cooperate as a witness, and I said yes, that I wanted there to be real consequences instead of my father just talking his way out like he always did. She said they'd be in touch about next steps and that the decision to file charges would come from her supervisor within a few weeks. I hung up feeling this careful kind of hope, like maybe the system would actually work this time, but I didn't want to count on it too much. Ivy called me 2 weeks after the protective order and said some items had arrived at her office from my father. I drove over and found a cardboard box with 3 textbooks that had water damage and bent covers, plus some clothes that smelled like they'd been stored in a damp basement. The chemistry textbook I'd annotated for a whole semester had pages stuck together, and my notes were barely readable. One of the shirts had a stain that definitely wasn't there when it disappeared from my closet. Looking at everything in worse shape than when it was stolen made me so angry I had to sit in Ivy's waiting room for 10 minutes before I could drive. She told me more stuff kept showing up as my father scrambled to comply with the court order, and she'd call whenever new items arrived. Shaw contacted me the next day after Ivy told him about the returned items. He said I should keep everything as evidence, instead of using or washing any of it, because the condition and how it came back might matter if criminal charges got filed. I took photos of every item from multiple angles, documenting the damage and writing down when each thing had originally been stolen based on my spreadsheet. Packed everything in plastic storage boxes and stacked them in the corner of my sublet next to the other boxes of evidence I'd been collecting for months. The pile was getting bigger, and I had to move my desk to make room for it all. 3 weeks after the hearing, I got an email from the appeals committee saying they'd reviewed my case and were changing one of my incomplete grades to the grade I'd earned before my laptop was stolen. The email included a letter from the professor who'd apologized, explaining that my work had been excellent until the theft and that she'd verified the police report and protective order as proof of what happened. The other incomplete still stood on my record because that professor sent a response saying I should have used cloud backup for important files and that technical problems didn't excuse missing deadlines. Gabriella called me when she saw the decision and said we could appeal the second incomplete again, but it would take time, or I could just retake the class over summer and move on. I decided to retake it because fighting with that professor seemed like more energy than it was worth, and I needed to graduate on schedule. My sublet lease was ending in 2 months, and I couldn't afford to keep paying rent without income. So, I met with my landlord and asked about extending through fall semester. He said the rent would go up $50 a month, but he could do it if I signed a new 6-month lease. I picked up extra shifts at the campus IT help desk to cover the increase, working 25 hours a week on top of my summer class. The schedule left me exhausted most days, but having my own space away from my parents felt necessary for staying sane. I couldn't imagine living at home again, even if they offered. Not after everything that happened. Gabriella emailed me saying my mother had dropped off a bag at her office with my name on it. I stopped by during office hours and found photo albums from when I was little, some jewelry my grandmother gave me before she died, and a few other small things I'd thought were gone forever. There was no note or explanation, just my stuff in a grocery bag left at the front desk. It felt like my mother's way of helping without openly going against my father, returning things secretly instead of making a big deal about it. I took the bag back to my sublet and put the photo albums on my bookshelf, looking through pictures of birthdays and holidays from before everything got bad. I met my mother at a coffee shop the following week after she sent 3 texts asking to talk. I got there early and picked a table near the door in case I needed to leave quickly. She showed up looking tired and sad and immediately started crying before she even sat down. I told her I needed to set some boundaries for us to have any kind of relationship going forward, that I couldn't pretend the theft and gaslighting never happened just to keep peace. She kept saying she was sorry and that she should have believed me sooner, but I stayed focused on what I needed instead of getting pulled into making her feel better. I said we could stay in contact through text only for now. No phone calls or surprise visits, and she had to respect that I wasn't ready to see or talk about my father. She agreed while wiping her eyes with napkins, saying she understood I needed space and wouldn't push me to reconcile with him. We sat there for another 20 minutes, making awkward small talk about my classes and her garden before I said I had to go. Driving back to campus, I felt relieved that I'd held my boundaries, even though seeing her cry made me feel guilty. The DA called me 6 weeks after our first conversation and said they were offering my father a plea deal for misdemeanor theft. The deal included paying me back the $1,000 he still owed in monthly payments, a $500 fine to the court, and 80 hours of community service. She explained his lawyer was pushing back and arguing for a lesser charge, but the DA's office thought the evidence was strong enough that they'd win at trial if needed. I told her through Ivy that I supported the plea deal if it meant guaranteed restitution and an actual criminal conviction on his record. I wanted documentation that this happened, official proof that I'd been telling the truth all along and not making things up like my father had claimed for years. 2 weeks later, Ivy called saying my father had accepted the plea instead of risking trial. He was pleading guilty to misdemeanor theft, and the judge had approved the sentence of $1,000 restitution in monthly $100 payments, the $500 fine, and 80 hours of community service. The conviction would go on his permanent record. I sat in my sublet after the call, just staring at the wall for a while, feeling the strange mix of relief and anger and exhaustion. It was over in terms of the legal case, but it didn't fix the years of stolen belongings or erase the gaslighting or make my family normal again. Still, having an official guilty verdict felt like validation, that I wasn't crazy or dramatic, that what happened was real theft and real abuse that a court recognized as criminal behavior. My phone buzzed 3 days later with a text from my mother that opened with an apology for not believing me sooner. She wrote that she should have protected me better and acknowledged she dismissed real theft as mental health problems for years. I read the message twice while sitting on my sublet couch, feeling a weird mix of relief and anger that took effort to sort through. I typed back a short response thanking her for the apology and saying I needed time before we could rebuild any trust. She replied asking if we could stay in touch through text only, no calls or visits, and I agreed to that boundary while making it clear I wasn't ready to discuss my father or hear any defense of his actions. The conversation ended there, and I set my phone down, surprised that holding firm on what I needed felt less scary than I'd expected after years of being pressured to smooth things over. I emailed Gabriella the next morning asking about the status of my grade appeals since the criminal case had concluded with a guilty plea. She responded within an hour saying she had good news and asking if I could come to her office that afternoon to go over everything. I walked across campus to the advising center and found Gabriella waiting with a folder of paperwork spread across her desk. She confirmed the grade change was official for my computer architecture class. The professor had submitted the revised grade based on my documented circumstances and the work I'd completed before the laptop theft. The other incomplete would stand as is because that professor maintained I should have used cloud backup for important files and that technical problems didn't excuse missing deadlines. Gabriella pulled up the summer course schedule on her computer and helped me register for the retake, then connected me to emergency financial aid forms that could cover the extra tuition since I'd lost income from the failed internship. I filled out the paperwork right there in her office, grateful she'd already highlighted which sections required immediate attention and which could wait for additional documentation. My academic standing was no longer in danger of probation or dismissal, though I'd still lost the research internship I'd planned to do over summer and the experience it would have added to my resume. Gabriella printed out my updated transcript and handed it to me along with the financial aid confirmation, saying the emergency funds should process within 2 weeks if I submitted supporting documents by Friday. I thanked her multiple times before leaving, feeling the weight of failed grades lift, even though the summer plans I'd worked toward were permanently gone. I called the internship company that afternoon to confirm they'd filled my position. The coordinator apologized, but said they couldn't hold it open after my incomplete grades made me ineligible. She suggested I reapply for their fall program once my academics were back on track, which felt like a polite way of saying they'd moved on to more reliable candidates. I hung up and opened my laptop to search for any summer work available on campus, needing both money for rent and somewhere to go every day that felt structured and safe. The campus IT department had a posting for full-time summer help desk support and basic network maintenance that had been up for 2 weeks. I applied immediately with my updated transcript and a cover letter explaining I was retaking one class, but available for 40 hours weekly otherwise. The IT supervisor called me the next day and offered the position after a brief phone interview where I walked through my technical skills and availability. It wasn't the prestigious research opportunity I'd lost, but it paid $15 an hour and kept me on campus where I felt secure instead of going back to my hometown. I accepted the job and marked my start date in my phone calendar, relieved to have summer plans that didn't involve explaining my criminal case to potential employers or hiding from my father in my sublet. Over the next 2 weeks, people who'd bought my stolen items started reaching out once word spread about the guilty plea and the full situation became public knowledge. Some sent apologetic emails saying they'd had no idea my father was lying about my permission to sell things. A few showed up at Gabriella's office with returned items since they didn't have my new address, leaving boxes of clothes and books and random belongings I'd written off as permanently gone. Most asked for refunds that I couldn't afford to give, but a handful just returned things without asking for money back, saying they felt terrible about unknowingly participating in theft. Daniel's brother sent a $50 gift card to a grocery store with a note saying he was sorry for buying the laptop and hoped the card helped with expenses. I kept the card and used it immediately for food shopping, appreciating the gesture, even though $50 didn't come close to covering the damage his purchase had enabled. I sorted through the returned items in my sublet and realized I didn't need or want most of them anymore. After years of learning to live without belongings I could rely on, I took photos of everything for documentation purposes, then listed a few pieces on a campus resale site to help cover rent. A desk lamp sold for $20. Some textbooks went for $35. And a winter coat I'd replaced brought in $40. I kept careful records of each sale with buyer information and amounts in case tax questions came up later or my father tried to claim I was selling stolen property. It felt strange to profit from my own belongings that had been stolen and returned. But I needed the money, and they were legitimately mine to sell now that the criminal case had established ownership. The extra $100 went straight into my rent fund while I waited for the financial aid to process and my IT job to start. Town gossip about my father spread through overlapping social circles and reached me through old classmates who messaged asking if the theft stories were really true. Some people expressed support and said they'd always thought my father's garage sales seemed suspicious. Others defended him and insisted it must have been a misunderstanding between family members that got blown out of proportion. A few suggested I should have just talked to my father privately instead of involving police and making everything public. I stopped responding to messages asking for my side of the story or wanting details about the case, focusing instead on my own recovery and letting the legal outcome speak for itself. The guilty plea was public record for anyone who actually wanted to know what happened instead of spreading opinions based on gossip. I drove to my old job the following Saturday to collect the last box of belongings from my boss's storage room. The items I'd stashed there years ago when hiding things at home became impossible. My boss met me in the back office and helped me carry out the box, which held my high school yearbooks, some jewelry from relatives, and electronics I'd kept safe by never bringing them home. I thanked her repeatedly for storing my things when my own house wasn't secure, explaining how much it had meant to have one place where belongings stayed where I put them. She hugged me tight and said she was proud of how I'd stood up for myself instead of accepting the theft as normal family dysfunction. We talked for a few minutes about my summer plans and my new IT job. Then I loaded the box into my car and drove back to my sublet, feeling grateful that at least one adult had believed me and helped when I needed it. I unpacked the box that evening and put the yearbooks on a shelf, the jewelry in a drawer, and the old electronics in my closet as backups in case anything broke. Having these items back felt like recovering pieces of my past that I'd written off as lost forever to my father's systematic theft. I drafted an email to both my parents, establishing clear boundaries for future contact, stating that communication would happen only through email going forward, and I wouldn't be sharing my new address or daily schedule with either of them. I explained I needed space to heal and rebuild my sense of safety after years of theft and gaslighting, and that I'd reach out when I was ready for any in-person contact. My mother responded within hours, saying she understood and accepted the boundaries, even though they made her sad. She asked if we could still do occasional lunch meetings in public places when I felt ready, and I said, maybe eventually, but not yet. My father sent one angry message saying I was being dramatic and punishing the whole family for mistakes he'd already paid for through the legal system. I read it once, didn't respond, and immediately blocked his email address so future messages wouldn't reach me. My mother sent another email asking me not to cut off all contact and saying she'd respect my boundaries without pushing for reconciliation with my father. I replied confirming I wasn't cutting her off completely, but needed the email-only protocol to feel safe while I processed everything that had happened. She agreed, and our exchange ended there, leaving me with a structured way to maintain minimal family connection without exposing myself to surprise visits or phone calls I wasn't ready for. I called campus counseling services the next day and scheduled an intake appointment for the following week to start working on the gaslighting trauma and rebuilding my sense of reality. The scheduler asked basic questions about my situation and matched me with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and psychological abuse. I marked the appointment in my calendar and felt nervous, but relieved to have professional support lined up instead of trying to process years of manipulation on my own. The counselor called 2 days before the appointment to confirm the time and briefly explain what to expect during intake, which helped reduce my anxiety about walking into the session. I spent the evening before the appointment writing out a timeline of the theft and gaslighting so I wouldn't forget important details or minimize what had happened when talking to someone new about it. I opened my recovered laptop and spent several hours rebuilding my digital portfolio from the project files that had survived the theft. My finals projects were still there, along with earlier coursework that demonstrated my programming skills and design abilities. I organized everything into a clean portfolio site and updated my resume to reflect the summer IT position and the retake course I'd be completing. I started applying to fall internship opportunities at tech companies and research labs, determined not to let my father's theft permanently damage my career trajectory, even though it had already cost me one major opportunity. Several applications asked about summer plans and gap periods in my academic timeline, and I wrote honest explanations about taking a class and working rather than doing research due to circumstances beyond my control. I didn't mention the theft or criminal case in the applications themselves, figuring I could explain if interviews came up and someone asked directly. The application process took most of a weekend, but I submitted 6 strong applications to programs that matched my skills and interests. I felt cautiously hopeful that my recovered grades and solid portfolio would outweigh the disrupted semester. Though I knew the lost internship had set me back compared to classmates who'd spent summer building experience and professional connections. I saved all the application confirmations in a folder and set reminders to follow up in 2 weeks if I hadn't heard back, then closed my laptop and let myself feel proud of rebuilding something my father had tried to destroy through theft and sabotage. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I sit in my sublet with my laptop open, working on a project for the summer IT job. My fingers move across the keyboard, writing code for a basic network monitoring script. And halfway through debugging a function, I realize something profound. I'm not constantly worried about someone stealing it or messing with my work. The laptop sits right there on my desk while I get up to make coffee, and I don't feel the need to hide it or take it with me to the kitchen. I come back with my mug, and the computer is exactly where I left it. Same as it was yesterday and the day before that. The absence of that background anxiety feels like breathing clearly for the first time in years. Like I didn't know how much energy I was spending on constant alertness until it stopped. I save my work and close the laptop without locking it in a drawer or checking the windows. Just leave it sitting there on my desk like a normal person would. 2 weeks later, an envelope shows up in my mailbox with no return address. And inside is a money order for $100 made out to me. The restitution payment arrived 2 weeks late according to the court schedule, but it's here now, so I take it to the bank and deposit it. I log the payment in my record spreadsheet with the date and amount, marking it as the first of 10 monthly installments if my father actually follows through with the full $1,000. The money helps with groceries that week since my budget is tight between rent and the summer class tuition, but it doesn't erase the damage or make up for the laptop theft or the failed finals. I'm realistic that full repayment will take time if it happens at all, given my father's history of avoiding responsibility and finding excuses. I buy eggs and bread and pasta with some of the money, practical stuff that stretches across multiple meals, and put the rest toward my electric bill. No ceremony, no expectation of gratitude, just logging the payment and moving on with my day. 3 days later, my mother sends an email asking about Thanksgiving plans in November. Her message is carefully worded to sound casual, but I can tell she's nervous about my response. I read it twice before replying, making sure I understand what she's actually asking versus what she's saying. I write back that I'll meet her for a public dinner at a restaurant for 2 hours maximum with no discussion of my father or pressure to reconcile with him. My message is clear about the boundaries, specific about the time limit and topics that are off limits, and I hit send before I can second-guess myself. She responds within an hour saying she accepts the terms and asks if I have a restaurant preference, her relief obvious even through email. I feel okay about maintaining some connection while protecting my boundaries. Knowing I can leave if she violates the agreement or tries to push me toward forgiveness, I'm not ready to give. I'm doing better now with my own space and clear boundaries and official validation that the theft was real and wrong. Though I still have moments of anger about the lost years and damaged education. Life isn't perfect, and I'm still working through trust issues and counseling every other week, talking about the gaslighting and learning to recognize manipulation patterns. The laptop sits safely on my desk where I can see it from my bed. My belongings stay where I put them without disappearing overnight. And I'm finally learning what it feels like to have control over my own property and life. I lock my door at night because I choose to, not because I'm afraid someone will steal from me while I sleep. My mail arrives and stays in my mailbox until I retrieve it. My clothes hang in my closet without vanishing. And my money sits in my bank account, earning interest instead of disappearing from hiding spots around a house that never felt safe. I still check my laptop's location settings sometimes out of habit. Still feel a flutter of panic when I can't immediately see my phone. But those reactions are getting less intense as time passes. I'm building a stable future on my own terms without constantly defending my reality to people who should have believed me from the start. So, I'm curious. If you were in my shoes, facing years of this kind of quiet, insidious betrayal, how would you have found the strength to fight back? Or have you ever had to draw a line in the sand with someone you loved when they crossed it one too many times? Let me know in the comments below.